Victory in Jesus, my Savior, forever. He taught me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is due him. He plunged me to victory beneath a cleansing flood. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior, forever. He taught me and he bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere before I knew him, and all my love is due him. He plunged me to victory beneath a cleansing flood. And if you are part of the Church of God in Christ, you would say, yes, yes, oh yes, 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 Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord. Ha! Yes. Hallelujah. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles, and this is another episode of Daring Dialogues. I do not apologize for my praise. Not now note and not one song. I hope everybody is doing great today. Hope you're having a wonderful, 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 wonderful thinking Thursday. If you're with us for the first time, pentatonic run, I feel you. I want to say, if you're with us for the first time, good morning to you. This is how we get down over here. And we're excited. I'm just excited. I thank God for the We Dare Squad. I want to say good morning to each and every one of you. Good morning to Lady Judy, Lady Ravonda, Life Transitions, Lady Ilana. Good morning to Lady Barbara, Prophet Jonathan, Pastor Ben, Lady Kenyatta, and those of you who are following us by various means. I get emails and inboxes all the time from people who say, hey, I can't comment because I'm watching by laptop, but I want you to know that we're watching and we appreciate what you're doing. So I also want to say, shout out to those of you who are watching us by laptop who may be in your offices right now and you can't speak and you can't comment, but you are listening in. I also want to say good morning to you as well. Good morning to our YouTube followers. If for some reason you ever get where you're not able to enter in on the Periscope, most times I am also simultaneously broadcasting on my YouTube channel. So make sure you go and subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is Church Love 333. That way, if you have any problems with Periscope, you can just hop right on over to the YouTube as well. And I know some down here do that as well. They kind of bounce back and forth. All right. So today, one quick one quick thing. Um, I do artistic commissions, and one of my artistic commissions had to do with designing a set of journals for a client. And I had some extra ones left over, and this is the last one because the other ones have been sold. So if you would like this journal, You can purchase it for $10. That includes the shipping on it. And you can purchase it at paypal.me // Life Nation. I only have one left. So email me first if you want to purchase it. That way I make sure that someone else has not already purchased it. But I've custom designed these journals, and inside I have inspirational quotes and action steps for the person who gets the journal. All right. So just want to let you know I have one left. All right. Today we are reading from, again, this is Theology Thursday, Thinking Thursday. We're reading from Thomas S. Oden's book, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. And we're helping people, hopefully, we're helping you to understand that Christianity came out of Africa. I cannot tell you how many people I run into on a weekly basis, especially through social media, who only get their education through Facebook memes. What do I mean by that? Many of them believe what Facebook or what social media tells them without doing any research. So I get people all the time telling me that Christianity is the white man's religion, and you're brainwashed and you shouldn't be worshiping this white Jesus. And then I have to correct them and say, well, clearly you haven't done your own research. Because if you did your own research, it would tell you and show you that Christianity is not the white man's religion. Okay, what we see in the West is a twisting of the original. So I'm going to encourage you to get back to the original to understand the foundation of the faith. All right. Believe it or not, there are many young African American people being drawn away by that lie, and they're being drawn actually into idolatry with some of these other ungodly things that are pulling on them to say you don't have to follow Christ, come follow us. And when you start digging into the things that they're telling you to follow, it actually leads you into idolatry and occultism. All right. So you have to be careful, and you have to question, why is someone telling me this false information? And if they are telling me that and they're telling me to try something else, where does that something else lead me? Because 9 times out of 10, it's not to something better, and it's not to something holy. It's usually to something occultic, or it's usually them telling you to come follow them as your leader. Yeah. And following people who are not led by God will lead you into a ditch. So this is where we're going to be reading again today. And today we're going to start out again with the cross and the lynching tree, which is the exploration of the spiritual world of African Americans and the two symbols that dominate not only the spiritual world but also the daily life of the African Americans in the 20th century. So he's talking about the symbols of the American past and the symbols of the American present. And he's talking about Black history, Christ and the cross, and how our suffering in the natural helps us to understand and how it ties into the suffering of the cross. So we have been getting a whole history education from James Cone, and I have been thoroughly enjoying it. So we are in chapter 2 now, in the cross and the lynching tree, the terrible beauty of the cross and the tragedy of the lynching tree. Here in this particular chapter, James Cone is going to dig into Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, if you've been reading with us from the book 11, you know that that author, Lynn Sweet, talks about Reinhold Niebuhr quite a bit. Remember, Reinhold Niebuhr, Reinhold, Reinhold was seen as one of the great theologians of Western Christianity, American Christianity. Even though he was not originally from here, a lot of his writings are what people rely upon and then depend upon. But James Cone does have some criticisms about Reinhold Niebuhr, which I think they are good criticisms that we need to take a look at. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next week or so. All right. Quote by Ray Stannard Baker. They murdered the Negro in cold blood in the jail doorway. Then they dragged him to the principal business street and hung him to a telegraph pole, afterwards riddling his lifeless body with revolver shots. And there the Negro hung until daylight the next morning, an unspeakably grisly, dangling horror. James Cutler said this, and somebody can quote this today. James Cutler said, "Our country's national crime is lynching." I actually happen to agree with that assessment. And the reason why I agree with that assessment is because now, since 2012, now, God has had our ministry, I know in particular, some other ministries around the nation dealing with America's original sins: racism, America's original sin, and all of the things that flowed out of the color line. And then also we know that lynching became a part of that result of the color line. So James Cutler says our country's national crime is lynching. And as you can tell, we still have lynchings going on in our nation. What is a lynching? A lynching is an extrajudicial killing. Okay? It's not just somebody being hung with a rope. A lynching, by definition, is an extrajudicial killing. That means you becoming the judge, the jury, and the executioner of a person without due process under the law. That is what happened with Botham Jean. Okay, he was lynched. That was a extrajudicial killing. Someone went into his apartment unarmed. He didn't do anything to anyone. He was at home minding his own business, and he was murdered in cold blood with no motive in his own apartment. That became an extrajudicial killing. All right? And people will keep wondering, why have they not charged her with murder? One of the reasons they haven't charged her with murder is because it goes down a little differently in Texas. If they charge you with murder in Texas, it's an execution. That's your sentencing, is execution. All right? So they didn't want to charge her with murder because it would have meant her sentencing would have been execution. All right? So just want to help you all understand that lynching does not necessarily mean by rope or by hanging. It simply means that the person was murdered before they stood before a jury, a trial, and the person who murdered them became the judge, the jury, and the executioner. They never saw justice. They never saw their day in court to be properly sentenced. The lynching tree, so strikingly similar to the cross on Golgotha, should have a prominent place in American images of Jesus' death, but it does not. In fact, the lynching tree has no place in American theological reflections about Jesus' cross or in the proclamation of Christian churches about his passion. The conspicuous absence of the lynching tree in American theological discourse and preaching is profoundly revealing, especially since the crucifixion was clearly a first century lynching. If you think about it, Jesus was lynched. I know people don't want to see that, but the reality was he was. He did not get a fair jury. He did not get a fair trial. He did not get a fair sentencing. They took him in the middle of the night, had a shady trial, got some false witnesses together, and decided, let's execute him. Yeah. In the lynching era between 1880 to 1940, white Christians lynched nearly 5,000 black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion of Jesus. Did you hear that? This is why I always tell people, and people are starting to see it now because it's going to have to come to a head. It was white Christians that were lynching black people, Christian or not. And I know people don't want to let that sink in, but I'm going to say it one more time. It was white Christians that were lynching black people who were Christian or not. Preachers were lynched. Mothers were lynched. Children were lynched. Pregnant black women were lynched and their babies were cut out of their stomach. Okay? So if you want to talk about the history of Western Christianity, that's the part that I don't really see the white church repenting for. Their part in lynching nearly 5,000 black men and women in a manner with obvious echoes to the Roman crucifixion of Jesus. You saw it last night. Yep. Good. If you have not seen the first Purge, I encourage you to go see it. It has a lot of echoes of what is happening right now. He says, yet these Christians did not see the irony or contradiction in their actions of lynching black people. And we have groups still here today, white groups, Christian identitarians who claim to be Christian, who believe in the annihilation and the genocide of black and brown people. So this spirit that is driving these people has not gone anywhere. As Jesus was an innocent victim of mob hysteria and Roman imperial violence, many African Americans were innocent victims of white mobs thirsting for blood in the name of God and in defense of segregation, white supremacy, and the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race. Exactly. Jesus was lynched. The servant is not greater than the master. Good point, Prophet Jonathan. Both the cross and the lynching tree were symbols of terror, instruments of torture and execution, reserved primarily for slaves, criminals, and insurrectionists, the lowest of the low in society. Both Jesus and blacks were publicly humiliated, subjected to the utmost indignity and cruelty. They were stripped in order to be deprived of dignity. They were paraded and mocked and whipped and pierced and derided and spat upon. They were tortured for hours in the presence of jeering crowds for popular entertainment. In both cases, the purpose was to strike terror in the subject community. It was to let people know that the same thing would happen to them if they did not stay in their place. What New Testament scholar Paula Fredrickson says about the crucifixion in Roman society could be substituted easily for lynching in the United States. Here's her statement. Crucifixion was a Roman form of public service announcement. How many public service announcements does CNN, MSNBC, CBS, NBC, and Fox give? Because you do know that replaying over and over again black people shot unarmed by police and Facebook and Twitter, you do know that this being replayed over and over and over and over again is a public service announcement for you to stay in your place, right? They're not playing it over and over again because they feel sympathy. You play those things over and over again because you want it to be instilled in the psyche of a people that if you get out of line, this will happen to you too. All right? This is why when people are still sending me people are still sending me videos after I tell them do not send me this stuff. Because I'm not going to share a whole lot of it on my Daring Dialogues page because I understand the psychology behind what is being done. It's psychological warfare. All right? So I will put up a report about what happens many times, but I try not to put too much of those videos on my page because I understand what it's designed to do. It is a public service announcement that says this can happen to you too. Do not engage in sedition as this person has, or your fate will be similar. Now, here's the thing, we know that this is also happening to Asians. We know that this is also happening to the Latino community. We know that this is also happening to some of the white ethnos, the white cultured community. But you notice they don't play their videos and run them on rerun. That's how you know that a specific community is being targeted with psychological warfare. If that were not the case, they would show all of the cases like this that are happening, but they do not. All right? The point of the exercise was not the death of the offender as such, but getting the attention of those watching. Crucifixion, first and foremost, is addressed to the audience. The crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans in Jerusalem and the lynching of blacks by whites in the United States are so amazingly similar that one wonders what blocks the American Christian imagination from seeing the connection. That the analogy between the cross and the lynching tree should have endured the Christian agents of white supremacy is perhaps not surprising. But how do we understand the failure of even the most progressive of America's white theologians and religious thinkers to make this connection? A case in point is Reinhold Niebuhr, widely regarded as America's most influential theologian in the 20th century and possibly in American history. Among his contemporaries, he was usually attuned to social reality and irony and tragedy of American history. Among white theologians, he was particularly sensitive to the evils of racism and spoke and wrote on many occasions of the sufferings of African Americans. Few theologians of the 20th century focused as much attention on the cross, one of the central themes of his work. And yet, even he failed to connect the cross and its most vivid reenactment in his time. To reflect on this failure is to address a defect in the conscience of white Christians and to suggest why African Americans have needed to trust and cultivate their own theological imagination. Born in 1892 in Wright City, Missouri, Niebuhr was the pastor of Bethel Evangelical Church in Detroit from 1915 to 1928, and later professor of Christian social ethics and theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York from 1928 to 1960, where he was the dominant voice in defining the discipline of Christian social ethics, the study of Christian action in society. His work had the most important impact on social thought and public policy of any Christian thinker of our time, writes Ronald Stone, an influential Niebuhr scholar, and his classic texts are still widely read in theology, history, social ethics, sociology, and political philosophy. Among theologians, Niebuhr was unusual for his wide influence in the secular political world. McGeorge Bundy called Niebuhr, quote, probably the most influential single mind in the development of American attitudes which combine moral purpose with a sense of political reality. His Christian realism, as opposed to what he regarded as naive or idealistic optimism, won the admiration of many secular intellectuals and politicians, including Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Hubert Humphrey, and Jimmy Carter. Even in the present time, President Barack Obama has called Niebuhr one of his favorite philosophers, and his name is invoked frequently by both liberals and conservatives, journalists and politicians, theologians and political philosophers. Best known for his realist approach in Christian social ethics, he rejected pacifism, idealism, and perfectionism, the idea that individuals and groups could achieve the standard of love that he saw revealed in Jesus' life, teachings, and death. Niebuhr taught that love is the absolute transcendent standard that stands in judgment over what human beings can actually achieve in history. Because of human finitude and humanity's natural tendency to deny it, sin, we can never fully reach that ethical standard. The best that humans can strive for is justice, which is love approximated, a balance of power among competing groups. Unlike the advocates of the social gospel who often suggest that we could through love build the kingdom of God on earth, Niebuhr placed justice rather than love at the center of Christian social ethics. Since human beings are finite, Niebuhr reasoned, that we can never do anything apart from our interests, especially when we act collectively. According to him, democracy, a method of finding approximate solutions to insoluble problems, was the political system best adapted to the strengths and limitations of human nature. As he put it famously in The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, quote, man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Since Niebuhr saw justice as a balance of power between groups, whether classes or ethnos or nations, he saw it always in the state of flux, never achieving perfection in history. To him, this meant that we must approach what we do practically, knowing that nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our own standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. Niebuhr takes his starting point for Christian realism as the facts of our experience, the willingness to take all factors into account, particularly the factors of self interest and power. So he's saying because of these two factors, that most people are going to look out for themselves and most people want power, we're not really going to come to perfection in this life in terms of how we treat people, which is why we need democracy. This starting point has significant implications for the question of race. When one begins with the facts of experience and not, as in Karl Barth's theology, with God's revelation, the conversation must confront the brutal realities of racial injustice, slavery, segregation, and lynching. While Barth's theology starts with the Trinity, with a focus on the Word of God, Niebuhr's theology and ethics starts with an emphasis on self-interest and power. This difference in starting point caused friction between Niebuhr and Barth for 30 years, especially in the context of the World Council of Churches and in the pages of the Christian Century. Niebuhr's realist approach to Christian ethics was deeply connected to the cross, which he identified as the heart of the Christian gospel. Quote, if the divine is made relevant to the human, Niebuhr claimed, it must transvalue our values and enter the human at the point where man is lowly rather than proud and where he is weak rather than strong. Therefore, I believe that God came in the form of a little child, born to humble parents in a manger. This life in the manger ended up on the cross, and we might end there if we really actually emulated the cross and his life. Transvaluation of values is a term derived from Nietzsche, who derided Christianity's embrace of the weak. It is the heart of Niebuhr's perspective on the cross. He uses the phrase repeatedly in his writings. We find its meaning whenever he speaks about God's mercy and love in relation to Jesus, especially in his sermons and several of his books. For Niebuhr, the revelation of God's transcendent love hidden in Jesus' suffering on the cross is not simply the keystone of the Christian faith, it is the very key to history itself. Lastly, as we stop today for this in this book, he says, the crucified Messiah is the final revelation of the divine character and divine purpose. He was rejected because people expected a Messiah who would be perfect in power and perfect in goodness. But the revelation of divine goodness in history must be powerless. If human power in history among races, nations, and other collectives, as well as individuals, is self interested power, then the revelation of divine goodness in history must be the weak and not the strong. The Christ is led as the lamb to the slaughter. Thus, God's revelation transvalues human values and turns them upside down. For Niebuhr, the cross is an ultimate point of illumination on the character of man and the character of God. People reject the cross because it contradicts historical values and expectations, just as Peter challenged Jesus for saying, the Son of Man must suffer. He went on to oppose the suffering by saying, far be it from you, this shall not happen to you. But Jesus rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan. In the course of a few moments, Peter went from being the mouthpiece of God to the tool of Satan because he could not connect vicarious suffering with the revelation of who God was. Suffering and death were not supposed to happen to the Messiah. He was expected to triumph over evil and not be defeated by it. But we know that in seemingly defeat, there came a resurrection and a victory, something that Peter and the disciples could not yet understand. How could God's revelation be found connected with the worst of deaths, the vilest death, a criminal's death on the tree of shame? Like the lynching tree in America, the cross in the time of Jesus was the most barbaric form of execution of the utmost cruelty, the absolute opposite of human value systems. It turned reason upside down. In his sermon lecture, The Transvaluation of Values in Beyond Tragedy, Niebuhr turns to Paul to express what it meant to see the world from a transcendent, divine point of view. We see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God have chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught the things that are, that no flesh shall glory in his presence. If you look at a group of people today in the United States, you can ask yourself, who are the foolish? Who are the weak? Who are considered the base? Who are the despised? Yes, God has chosen the things which are not to bring to naught the things that are. We're going to stop there today in the cross and the lynching tree. Wow. Somebody keeps saying, where are the lost tribes of Israel? Where are the lost tribes of Israel? Look around you. Who most reflects the children of Israel in our society today? Dun, 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 dun. What other group of 5,000 people do you know were strung up in like manner as Christ? Selah. All right, just gave you something, a little something to think about. Chapter 3, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. We're talking today about defining Africa. Defining Africa. All right. And I believe we're going to get through probably about halfway today. We'll see. It is an odd but understandable question to ask. Just how African, just how African was Athanasius, who grew up in Egypt? How African was Augustine, who grew up in Numidia? Is it descriptively correct to say that Cyprian was an African? However valuable their contributions to the Western thought may be, their status as genuine Africans has, for very odd reasons, remained under a cloud and will until this question is candidly faced. The argument for the recovery of early African Christianity cannot easily proceed unless it can be shown that these great intellects of their time were truly Africans, not just in the geographical sense, but in spirit and temperament, not just temporary day trippers to Africa, but born and bred in Africa, indigenized in families, living through generations of African life. I believe that there is nothing phony in their African Christian identity. Many were willing to die for that identity. So, establishing the indigenous depth of early African Christianity, that is what the writer is here to do today. A demeaning prejudice has crept into historical lore that these great figures were not African at all, merely Europeans in disguise. Now you have to understand, why would this be important to divorce these early theologians from their Africanness? Why would it be important for people to, just like they did Jesus, by the way, why would it be important for people to come along and Europeanize the early African scholars? Well, because if I strip your ethnos from you and I paint you as a European, then I can lay claim to your intellect. I can lay claim to your theological discoveries. And I can say that it originated with my people as opposed to originating out of Africa, thereby divorcing people's desire to want to seek out African scholars, because I have convinced you that the early scholars were all European, which again ties back into the lie of European superiority. And therefore, the lie continues and is perpetuated by Western seminaries who do not teach that the early scholars were African. All right? So when people ask me what are some issues I have with European seminaries, number one problem I have is they don't start from the beginning. They only start with people that they deem are legit. Okay? This is a fairly recent Western intellectual prejudice. It suggests that the African intellectual tradition cannot even claim its own sons and daughters, especially if they happen to be articulate. There's that word again. Or if they were sufficiently astute to speak in the common international academic, commercial, and political languages of the day. According to that bias, the greater those competencies, the less African they would be. The more provincial, the more truly African. The more cosmopolitan, which simply means sophisticated, the less African. We do not want to go there. If so, the African continent cannot embrace as its own even Didymus the blind, or the great desert mother Sarah, or the tall brothers of Wadi al-Natrun. Even more ludicrous is the claim that the African continent cannot include Theban born Pachomius or Numidian born Optatus, Optatus. Whether Tertullian and Cyprian and Augustine learned everything from Rome can easily be answered on the basis of impartial textual analysis. These Africans were being seriously read in Rome during their lifetimes when they were living in Africa because they were teaching in a way pertinent and useful to Rome and the awakening wider European ethos. Among the most decisive things Augustine personally learned in Italy, according to his own confessions, was the impact made upon him by hearing from Pontitanus of the Holy Life of Anthony of the African Desert, written by the African patriarch Athanasius. Look at a map of Egypt and review the geological range of pastoral responsibility of Athanasius. All right, and I think they have a map for us. It says see map number 6. All right, so that's on the next page. It was the whole of the lower delta and the middle Nile Valley with diocesan responsibilities reaching beyond the first cataracts with their widely varied subcultures and languages. This African patriarch Athanasius was responsible not just with the Alexandrians who spoke Greek. In any case, the ethnographic evidence shows that a large portion of Alexandrians were themselves Egyptian ethnics, many of whom doubtless spoke several languages such as Syriac, Proto-Arabic, Aramaic, Nilotic variants, etc., in order to deal with commercial realities in that greatest of international port cities. So here you go again. This is Athanasius' pastoral responsibility. All right. These are all the places that he would have been in charge of in Africa. Let me see if I can bring that a little closer. Not just one or two churches in a city, but he would have been in charge of this entire region, which means he would have been speaking Greek, he would have been speaking Aramaic, he would have been speaking Arabic, because he had a range of people that he was overseeing. So of course, I don't want him, if I'm a white supremacist, I don't want him to be a black man. It's really that simple. Because that would disprove my superiority. Anthony of the Desert lived most of his 100+ years in a very remote part of the far eastern desert of Egypt, many days' journey from any Greek-speaking city. It is inexact to simply identify Anthony as an Alexandrian without remembering the mountain cave where he founded anchorite monasticism. Remember, we told you in the other book that those who are of the original faith, how they escaped and went into the mountains and went into Egypt and went into areas of solitary because they were trying to get away from the perverting of the gospel that was beginning to happen, and how some of them, people actually went to go find them to bring them out of their caves, like the prophets of today, to bring them out of their caves and to bring them out of their solitariness and bring them into the imperial church that they were forming. Kind of sounds like today with all of these networks and people searching for people to join them, but that's a whole other scope. So he founded a type of monasticism, and they were meeting in the caves in the mountains. All right. Athanasius spent long periods of time in the Egyptian desert, in hiding or in forced exile. Only seated prejudices can blithely charge that these great leaders were not genuinely African. Almost every turn in African Christian history is misjudged if it lives by the premise that Europeans have a natural advantage built into their intellectual DNA. This bungled premise misreads the significance of the inland African struggles of Coptic Christianity for centuries following the Arab conquest. The stereotype also misjudges the depth of the encounter of early African Christianity with indigenous Punic and Berber cultures. It misreads the relation of Christianity to the Nilotic speaking traditional African religions in the southern part of the Nile, which extends all the way to present day Sudan and Uganda. It considers as negligible the subtle dialectical forms of cultural interaction between Christianity and African cultures that occurred gradually over centuries of shared hazards and mutual learning. There is an enduring pre Christian traditional African religious past in the north of Africa during the entire first Christian millennium. You have Pharaonic, you have Proto Nubian, you have Libyan, Capsian, and Ghanaian reaching far back into African prehistory. It remains indigenously African even while being militarily forced to adapt to multiple colonial coercions. Early Christianity had to deal with these deeply ingrained traditional African cultures in the isolated villages of the Maghreb and the Nile, not only with Greco Roman civic religion. It was the strength of that traditional African religion transformed by Christianity that stood up to idolatrous Roman civic religion, now known as idolatrous Roman civic religion, which would become Catholicism. The study of comparative metaphors makes clear how the motifs of ancient pharaonic religion, such as the spiritual ascent and eternal life, were echoed and included in the works of Origen, Athanasius, and Pachomius. The stereotyping of African Hellenism as non-African. The stereotype of Alexandria as a small olive patch of Greece planted on the coast of Africa by aliens became less and less true with each century after Bishop Demetrius. This stereotype of Alexandria as a totally Greek city forgets just how international the huge American metropolis had become as early as the time of Philo. So, saying that Alexandria, which is in Africa, is a Greek city is like saying Miami, which is in the United States, is a Cuban city. Now, if you've ever been to Miami, you know that yes, there is a large Cuban population living in Miami. They started coming, I believe, in the late 60s all the way into the mid 80s. All right? But Miami is not Cuba. There's a large population of Cubans living there. But in Miami, you have a large Haitian population. You have a large Bahamian and Jamaican population. You have a large African American presence. You used to have a large European presence, but many of them moved from Miami up to the Panhandle, Tallahassee, Pensacola area. All right? So it would be the same to say Alexandria was a little Greece, would be the same as saying that Miami is just populated by people from Cuba and nobody else lives there. All right? The multi-ethnic trading interests, which had established wide routes of commerce to and from Alexandria, incorporated and prized the cultures of the Nile far south of the Delta and the cultures of the Maghreb far to the west. The fact that some Africans were Greek speaking did not make them any less African. Similarly, to speak Latin in a Libyan port city did not make the ethnically Berber speaker of Sabratha any less African. To define Theban and Pachomian monasticism essentially as Greek is to misunderstand its language, its worldview, and its social location. Even if its leaders wrote publicly in Greek, they continued to speak to a Nilotic culture in Nilotic metaphors. That would also be like saying that just because there are countries in Africa now where they speak English, that doesn't make them European. That doesn't make them American. They are Africans who speak English. Even the leaders in Alexandria had the Nile Delta and Valley to deal with commercially, and it had a culture dating more than 1,000 years older than Alexandria. So, by what magic could Alexandria be cut adrift from its whole continental context and reality? If modern African Christianity had better grounded in an ancient African ecumenical teachings, it would never have felt compelled to be defensive about Hellenistic voices in its own African tradition. For Hellenism in Africa had become profoundly Africanized over the very long period of time of some 20 generations, even before Origin. Modern African Christians need to get this straight in order to recover their actual historic identity as African. Otherwise, Africa needlessly deprives itself of its own heritage. And I am already seeing that with some of my African friends who, for whatever reason, do not know that Christianity came out of Africa. That's actually pretty scary that you're on the continent of Africa and you're talking to me as a black American in the United States and you're telling me that Christianity didn't come out of Africa. That's crazy. Scientific inquiry into the ethnicity of early African Christian writers. This is going to be our last section for today. Whenever these matters are discussed, the speculative question soon arises as to the ethnic identity and even the skin color of writers like Tertullian, Cyprian, Optatus, Verecundus, and Augustine. In this arena, the recent paleographic inquiry into funerary inscriptions and family names bears interesting details pertinent to this question. The evidence shows that there was a gradual transition of Berber, Libyan, and Punic family names into their Latin or Greek equivalents during the centuries prior to and during the growth of Christianity. It would be like me speaking Hebrew, and rather than being called Shantae by my American name, which is actually a French derivative, but rather than me being called Shantae, it would be like going over to Jerusalem, learning Hebrew, living there, and people call me by my Hebrew name equivalent, which would be Shalom. That's what was happening. All right? So, that did not affect their ethnicity or skin color, only their names. Thus, it would not be extraordinary if a person with tribal and family ties reaching thousands of years back into indigenous African history might have a Latin sounding name. It is likely that Augustine had a mother with Berber background from a family that converted to Christianity at least a generation before his birth in 354. Monica would not have become any less ethnically African just because she married a military officer with a Roman sounding name. Augustine was born and raised in a remote inland Numidian town with mixed racial stock. The rock carvings from Neolithic times in Numidia show occupation dating back 10,000 years. Among Augustine's known family and friends were people who had Berber, Punic, Numidian, Roman, and even Libyan names. Christians living before Athanasius were long settled in the Middle Nile as far south as O and Fayum. Athanasius, according to his own statement, came from an environment of very modest means, not from a foreign elite. As a child, he was noticed playing on the beach by Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, and virtually adopted as if an orphan, according to an early tradition. This leaves entirely mute the genetics of the great leader, but there are many indications that he kept close and active ties with the Middle Nile ethnics of many varieties who spoke Proto Coptic, or cognate Nilotic based languages. When he was forced into exile, he sought refuge in the desert areas far away from the cosmopolitan, Greek speaking urban ethos of Alexandria. There can be no doubt that Origen grew up in Africa, wrote much of his work in Africa, and then transmitted his extensive African library and teaching to Caesarea Palestina. It is a strange and demeaning criterion to apply to Origen the odd assumption that because he was adept at many languages, that he was not also very African. By his metaphors, the greatest biblical interpreter of early Christianity shows many indications of being indigenously African, whatever his specific ethnicity. Scholars are thus challenged with the puzzling complication of delving into the mutation of family names and place names associated with the most important contributors to early African Christianity. Further, paleographical, archaeological, and linguistic evidence may gradually yield more light on these speculations. Scientific studies of DNA, mitochondrial genes, and migration patterns are being refined and may in due time provide more discernment. In the writings of Philo, Synesius, Victor of Vita, and Chanute of Atreat, had all been written in France, they would be called European, but they were not. They were written in Africa. So why shouldn't they be called African? There is a prejudice at work here. Suspect anything of intellectual value that comes from the African continent as having some sort of secret European origin. What convincing argument can be set forth to deny their Africanness? How black were the Christians of North Africa? Black enough if blackness is understood in terms of intergenerational suffering and oppression. If black is defined by color, a trip to Numidia or Nubia or Ethiopia settles the chromatological argument. But Orthodox Christians do not admit skin color as a criterion for judging Christian truth. Never have, never will. African Christianity is not primarily a racial story, but a confessional story of martyrs and lives lived by faith active in love. To judge truth only by race itself is heretical, and that truth was first clearly formulated in ecumenical Christianity from the Jerusalem Council and the early baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch and following, and that truth itself became a standard assumption of early African Christianity. Hence, for the purposes of this discussion, if a text was written in Africa, it will be treated as African. That is a simple, straightforward criterion, much clearer than speculations about ethnicity or pigment as decisive criteria for Africanness. If to be an African Christian requires that one be a particular skin color, that would rule out all Orthodox Christians of all hues who would quickly disavow such unorthodox and counter biblical requirements. So, I want to encourage you to check out these biblical scholars. There is a website that you can go to called Jude number 3 Project. Jude 3 Project. I believe it's .com. If it's not .com, it's .org. And they have a whole section on there for resources. Underneath there, you can look at the different articles they have. All right. And they have several articles that you can read up on each African father. Good morning. You can read up on each African father. All right. And they also have images on there of the African fathers. Another good website that you want to check out is called blackhistoryinthebible.com. blackhistoryinthebible.com. And this writer goes into several different details about the presence of black people in the Bible. What does it mean when it says that in Revelations that God sat upon the throne and he was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone? Go and Google jasper and sardine stones and hit images and see what color was emanating from the throne. I just challenge you to do it. All right. So, this has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I have been your host today, Shantae Charles. I hope that I have said something today to get you thinking, to get you researching, to get you digging a little bit deeper. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so please go out and be light. Tomorrow, we're going to be finishing up the week talking about bad foods or supposedly bad foods in the Bible, the Bad Food Bible. We're going to be looking at meat as our main study. And then also, we're going to be in the book Wealth Can't Wait. Wealth Can't Wait. Looking at wealth from the standpoint of a real estate investor. All right. So remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. So please go out today and be light. Also, lastly, I did a coaching session teaching last night on Facebook Live. It's no longer up there, but if you would like to purchase the replay, you can go to paypal.me/Life Nation. The subject that we covered was purpose, gifts, and talents, and coming into your own uniqueness, understanding your purpose, your gifts, and your talents, and coming into your own uniqueness. The replay is only $10, so if you order it, make sure you notate coaching replay, and I will send you the link. Make sure you have your email address that you want the link sent to inside of the note. All right. Again, I want to thank you for your time and attention. Take care and see you on the other side of glory.